You could start recording. Good evening, everybody. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you all to tonight's event, which is launching the Wiener Holocaust Library's new online resource, Testifying to the Truth, Eyewitnesses to the Holocaust. My name is Toby Simpson, and I'm the director of the library. Many of us have been moved this week by commemorations around the world for Holocaust Memorial Day 2021. The theme for this year has been Be the Light in the Darkness, and for that reason it feels very appropriate to be involved in an event which is bringing to light extraordinary early eyewitness accounts, primarily composed by Holocaust survivors, or rather created in interviews with Holocaust survivors. These are now freely available online, and we're extremely proud of that. I'm going to begin by speaking a bit about how this came to being, how this resource came to being. And then I will be introducing some wonderful speakers who are going to speak on a panel this evening. We're going to hear from Dr. Christine Schmidt from the library. We'll also be hearing from one of the volunteer translators who worked on the project, Jenifer Ball. And then we'll also be hearing from historians Mark Roseman and Sharon Kangisser-Cohen. Okay, so just to begin, the roots of this project began actually when the library moved from Devonshire Street to Russell Square in 2011. This began with a 4-year project entitled Keeping Truth Alive, and that was all about establishing new educational and outreach opportunities for the library. Part of that was boosting our digital presence. And there were many strands to this. One part was creating a volunteer translation program. And actually some members of the original group of volunteers starting all those years ago in 2011, I'm delighted to say are still working with the library as volunteer translators, and some are here tonight. So Beverly Simmons, Sue Boswell, it's really amazing to still be working with you 9 years on from starting the project. So we didn't actually begin translating this particular collection until a bit later. The roots of it really began with other digital projects. So I wanted to pay a bit of tribute to Jess Green, who was the library's first digital curator. And actually, the first project she worked on was a refugee family papers project, which was the library's very first ever digital resource. And we've recently been awarded Arts Council funding to reimagine that project. So it's great that that still has a wonderful future ahead of it to showcase the amazing documents, diaries, photographs, personal papers of the many families who have deposited their material with us. And that's extraordinarily moving material. But the other aspect that Jess and I were really keen to share with the world was the library's early eyewitness testimonies. Now, there are two, I would say there are two collections of eyewitness testimonies that are really exceptionally interesting at the library. And with the launch of this resource, we've now brought both of them online in some form. And so the first of those actually is the library's accounts from Kristallnacht, which were gathered immediately after the November 1938 pogroms in Germany and Austria. And those accounts were translated in full and placed online in 2017. We knew, though, that we wanted to bring the larger collection, the collection created by the library's employees in the 1950s, we wanted to bring that to a much wider audience. And that was a huge challenge, because we're talking about accounts relating to about 1,200 different accounts. We're talking about 20,000 plus pages of material, and the vast majority was not in English. So that confronted us with a huge challenge. And tonight's event is in large part about celebrating the immense milestone of publishing the first 400 of those accounts online and making them accessible to all. The accounts, others will speak in more detail about them, but I just want to say a few words about how extraordinary they are. They're unusual in terms of their origins within the German Jewish refugee community in Britain. Many of the interviewers who created these accounts were themselves survivors, and they're remarkable in terms of the time and place in which they were gathered, the people who gathered them, and Christine will be speaking about that in more detail. But to me, they're also remarkable because they reflect such a wide range of experiences of the Holocaust. They cover so many different aspects of Nazi persecution and also different aspects of survival, both survival of Jewish and non-Jewish victims of Nazi persecution, covering many countries and also ranging in time from years long before the Nazis came to power, and also in some cases discussing the period after 1945 and the experience of surviving the Holocaust and returning to some form of normal life. So just as one unusual example, there is an account, a first-person narrative of a woman called Hermine Horvath, a Romany woman who survived a number of Nazi camps. And I think the rare nature of early eyewitness accounts from Romany survivors gives some hint of the exceptional historical interest of this collection. I'm very proud, therefore, that we'll be able to make these amazing, unique materials available online. And I can think of no better way to mark Holocaust Memorial Day than sharing these accounts with the world. So as I say, at the beginning of this project, we set out with big aims. We wanted not only to help researchers who, of course, this material has huge potential for people writing studies of the Holocaust, but we also wanted to make this material more accessible for teachers or educators, or even students, perhaps people studying the Holocaust in sixth forms across the world, well, you know, in schools across the world, but also at universities across the world. So practically this meant digitizing the material, transcribing it, translating it, and that of course would not have been possible without contributions from a huge number of people who I want to pay tribute to this evening. So the testimonies are now available, as I say, online, and I'll now briefly show the website. If I can just get it up on the screen. I apologize, I seem to be having some problem screen sharing. I'll see if I can, okay, I think it might work now, apologies. I hope that you can now see the website on your screens. This is the homepage, and the accounts are fully searchable. I'll just take you to the search page, and you can see that as well as being able to search using the search bar, as you might do if you're using Google, we also have indexed the accounts according to subject terms, and noted those that are available in English, and you're also able to search by date range and also by the eyewitness themselves. And you can see also that we've distinguished between those materials that are actually eyewitness accounts and other documentation. As you'll hear from Christine soon, there's also a range of other kinds of documentation that were gathered as part of the process of gathering the material in the 1950s. I'll draw up one of the accounts here. So, for example, this is an account that was actually a report by Alfred Wiener, the founder of the library, who compiled an account of Jewish life in Benchen, which was actually the town where he grew up. And again, that suggests something about the diversity of material here. And so there's a description of the account. There's also a link to allow you to look at the original scan. And then you have the option of seeing the account in its English translation or in German original. And so, as I suggested at the outset, there are 400 accounts that have been published today, and we will be following up from this, publishing further accounts over the years and months to come, and we're looking to publish the collection in its entirety once all of the translations are complete and fully checked. So I just want to say a few last words about the resource. So the resource, as I say, it was intended primarily to give access to the accounts online, but also to provide access to English translations for the first time. And we wanted to ensure that they would be as accessible as possible for researchers, and that the material would be easy to use and easy to find. But we nevertheless are still looking to make ongoing improvements to the site. And one of the benefits of it being online is we've also are going to be inviting feedback, including from the audience. So please do visit testifyingtothetruth.co.uk, explore the site, and if you have any suggestions for improvements or changes, please do contact us. Okay, so before I begin the panel, I just want to conclude my remarks by offering thanks to the many people who have contributed to the project. I want to say a special thanks to Leah Sidebotham, who has done an amazing job quality assuring the site, making changes and improvements to the functionality of the site, user testing it, and organizing the material, uploading translations and transcriptions, and she's been absolutely fantastic throughout the process. So I want to pay a big tribute to Leah Sidebotham, the library's digital asset manager. I also want to say a big thank you to Martina Ravignan. So after I finished working with the volunteer translators, Martina very ably took on the work of coordinating the work of the dozens of translators who have contributed to this project, which is you know a lot of work, and she's done an absolutely brilliant job. And I'm sure all of the volunteer translators who have been involved would second what I'm saying in my thanks to Martina. I've mentioned Jessica Green. There were other members of the library staff, Bianca Bailey, for example, Christine Schmidt, who's here tonight, but also Ben Barco, an important role in bringing this project about. I want to thank Sally Seeley at the Department for Communities and Local Government, and in general the Department for Communities and Local Government for funding the work. I want to thank Intranda, the tech company who have done such a brilliant job in putting the resource together. Uli Smalley, who did a huge amount of work on cataloguing the material, which is all now fully indexed and catalogued. I also want to thank Ruth Levitt, who sadly is no longer with us, but was an amazing volunteer who pioneered the pogrom of November 1938 translation work, which was really the predecessor of this project. And without that, this project would not have been possible. And then really, perhaps the biggest thanks of all has to go to the volunteers. And I'll just start with, actually, the library runs a program supporting volunteers from the Action Service for Reconciliation and Peace, which involves young volunteers coming over from Germany to work at the library. And even today, Marie, our current ARSP volunteer, is doing work on quality assuring translations and transcriptions, and she's doing a fantastic job. Laura Schloman and also Emma Hansen did hours of amazing work working on translations and quality assuring translations. I want to say thank you to them. And I also want to say a huge thank you to all of the dozens of volunteer translators. I probably don't have time to go through all of their names, but just a few examples. Jennifer, who joins us this evening, Shoshana Hoffman, Des McGuire, Karen Watkins, Lydia Creech, David Worth, Ruth Morris, Sue Boswell, Beverly Simmons, Birgit Wilt. Thank you all. I mean, I've by no means mentioned all of the amazing translators who have contributed to this project. There's been so many, as I say, dozens and dozens, but without you, this absolutely would not have been possible. So I just want to say a huge thank you to all of them. So, enough for me. I'm going to begin tonight's panel by turning to the history of this extraordinary collection. And it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Christine Schmidt. Dr. Christine Schmidt is the library's Deputy Director and Head of Research, as well as curating several wonderful exhibitions, including a fascinating forthcoming exhibition, Death Marches, Evidence and Memory, which will open next month. Christine leads the library's research activities and partnerships. And this important work includes establishing a recently launched Holocaust and Genocide Research Partnership, which is an exciting initiative working with the Holocaust Research Institute at Royal Holloway, University of London, the University of Huddersfield, and the Holocaust Survivors Friendship Association. Christine is a historian of the Holocaust and the author of several scholarly articles, including We Are All Witnesses, Ava Reichman and the Wiener Library's Eyewitness Accounts collection, and Tracing and Documenting Nazi Victims, Past and Present, Those Left Behind. Over to you, Christine. Thank you.
Thanks, Toby. Thanks for the introduction, and to everyone for joining to mark the launch of this important resource. And just to add to the thanks, I really wanted to congratulate my colleagues too, especially Toby, whose leadership has been so important for this project. I know, Toby, you can't thank yourself, but I think we owe you a lot of thanks for this project coming to fruition. And also, of course, to Leah and Martina for seeing it over the finish line, and to reiterate your thanks to the volunteers and interns who have contributed so much to making it happen, and many of whom I see actually on the call tonight. So it's very good to see. I'm going to just share my screen. I have a short, just a few slides. Everybody see that, I hope. Does that work? Can you see it?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, great. And I think it's significant that we start by thinking of how this collection came to be, because by considering its history and the individuals who brought it into being, the kind of the how and the why, we can better appreciate the legacy we're taking forward in opening access to the material in this way. And so I'll begin with this oft-mentioned quote from Dr. Ava Reichman, who led the project on behalf of the library, here writing in 1954. She said, "We all bear witness," she wrote, "we all have a duty to fulfill towards our past. Political developments on a global as well as on the Jewish level are not too auspicious for keeping alive the memory of German Jewry." End quote. And in many ways, this call that she published in the Association of Jewish Refugees Journal in 1954 sets the stage for our understanding of the project. It highlights the meaning of this collecting work to the survivor and refugee community in Britain and beyond. For the collection of accounts is not only significant, I think, for the rich content of the accounts, which Toby alluded to, and what they can reveal about, quote, unknown events or unknown aspects of known events, in the words of Alessandro Portelli, but also it's significant, how the collection was developed and created is very significant. And the links to communities and networks of survivors after the war and people who knew them is paramount. The project was supported by the Claims Conference, and it was carried out over about 5 years, and it amassed over 1,200 accounts. The interviewers included many women, and many were Holocaust survivors and refugees themselves, who were both being interviewed and who were also conducting interviews. And in many ways, this project continued the important work that the library's founder, Dr. Alfred Wiener, and colleagues had been carrying out since before Hitler's rise to power, collecting documentation on Nazism, which supported their activism in order to undermine the Nazis' activities. And just as an aside, we've just published some of Alfred Wiener's earliest writings in a partnership with Granta, and I'll put some information about that new publication in the chat. Just can't miss the opportunity to plug this new incredible book that we've just published in the last week. But after the war, the project emerged, this particular project emerged at a critical point in the library's institutional history, and its work had to shift from collecting in order to undermine to collecting to preserve and facilitate research. And so the library turned more purposefully to gathering victim narratives of persecution, collecting a variety of different forms of testimony, including personal accounts, but also letters, court depositions, and other kinds of documents that were donated by the interviewees, and which Toby pointed out in the separate section. So the project fits, I think, within a long tradition of Gröbenforschung, and built on foundational research that was already underway after the war in the DP camps. The project also rested on methodologies that the library's predecessor organization, the Jewish Central Information Office, was using in the 1930s, and Toby also alluded to these, for example, gathering eyewitness accounts, some 350 of them, in the days and weeks after Kristallnacht. And in 1946, the library also published Jewish Survivors Report, Documents of Nazi Guilt, which you see here. The project began after the library hired new staff, like Eva Reichman, who became the director of research in 1945. She and her husband, the jurist Hans Reichman, had left Germany for London after he'd been rounded up during Kristallnacht and released from Sachsenhausen with her help. And like Alfred Wiener, she had worked for the Zentralverein, the Central Association of German Citizens of Jewish Faith, before fleeing to England. She was a prolific writer and thinker on anti-Semitism and antecedents to the Holocaust, and she completed a second doctorate at the LSE, which was published in 1950 as Hostages of Civilization, which you see here. And this provided a critical treatment of the debate on the alleged failure of Jewish emancipation and its relationship to the Holocaust. And she became extensively involved in the German-speaking Jewish refugee community in England. And in her obituary, Arnold Pauker of the Leo Baeck Institute called her, quote, one of the greatest German Jewish women of this century. And so for Reichman, the imperative to collect grew out of both her scholarship and critical work in the area of communal defense. And one can see in various writing that she did about the project at this time that she aimed to memorialize a culture and society that had been effectively destroyed and to promote future research. She saw gathering eyewitness accounts as a means to fill gaps in the record of evidence that she saw being left by the purposeful destruction of documents during the war or the potential unreliability of documents due to censorship. And so in Reichman's view, these accounts would give a record of, quote, personal experiences of the time of enforced silence. She directed a small group of paid staff members and relied on additional volunteers to conduct interviews and collect the reports. Now, interviewers are based throughout Europe, and they traced, contacted, and persuaded potential interviewees to participate, usually by word of mouth or advertisements through advertisements in newspapers and the like. And they began close to London, somewhat haphazardly at first, but eventually they became more systematic. And about the reports themselves, they were occasionally drawn up by the authors themselves, but essentially these were heavily mediated and drawn up by both the interviewer and the interviewee. And after one or more interviewers, the report was drawn up and it was then reviewed by Reichman and her staff, quote, to ensure that it contained no mistake or misunderstanding. And then it was checked with the interviewee and often signed off. It was then incorporated into the archive, cross-indexed, and cataloged. And I won't get into the kind of elaborate cataloging system that they use, but you can actually look at it on the website and see for yourself. Among the interviewees included well-known contributors such as Inge Deutschkran, Anita Lasker-Wallerfish, and Hage Adler, who also conducted interviews himself. And one of the participants in the project was Dr. Nelly Wolfheim, who is pictured here, who was both interviewed and an interviewer. She was an expert in early childhood psychoanalysis and pedagogy, but she was banned from her work due to anti-Jewish laws in Germany and managed to flee to Britain. And her expertise shaped the way that her interviews were conducted and recorded, and the content often focused on the psychological profiles and history of the interviewee. She also had an eye toward recording interviews with elderly survivors as well, accounts we often don't hear in later oral history or testimony projects. So just to conclude, I think it's worth drawing attention to the individuals who so much shaped this project. So I'm kind of talking about, Toby talked about the history of the project from in the context of moving to our new building, and then I've kind of taken a step further back to think about the other personalities involved. And I think it's important to reflect on the similarities between Wiener and Reichman and how their interrupted lives and identities in exile shaped this work and propelled them to collect and preserve evidence. Reichman published an essay in a special edition of the Wiener Library Bulletin in 1983 that was ostensibly about her former boss, but contains much that might equally have applied to her. They both traveled regularly and sometimes together to Germany in the 1950s to address student groups and to work toward reconciliation. She writes of Wiener, but admits to sharing his happy vision. Quote, "To him, these study groups and weekend conferences in Germany became a revelation. He radiated happiness when he told of them, and more than once I had the good fortune to share the joyful experience with him. After terrible upheavals, he was once again blessed with a renewal of youth. In such hours of elation, it was as it had been before. He swept away awkward uncertainties and spoke again of the synthesis of German and Jewish ideals in which he had believed in his youthful beginnings. Though the world which it had once reflected lay in ruins, shattered beyond resurrection, his life, the life of a German Jew, had come full circle." End quote. So in a sense, both the library in the 1950s and the Eyewitness Accounts Project represent a sort of last-ditch attempt by Alfred Wiener and Eva Reichmann to fulfill a vision of an institution rooted in the values of the Enlightenment and Weimar Germany and imbued with the spirit of German Jewry as they perceived it. This was sadly likely doomed to fail because they had few intellectual heirs or successors. Yet I think their struggle can be seen as valiant since, if nothing else, it expressed a determination to frame future public understanding of the Holocaust in ways that honored the humanity of the murdered. So with that, thank you for listening to this quick run through of the history of the project. I'll stop sharing my screen and then I will pass back to Toby so he can introduce our next speaker.
Thank you very much, Christine. I think that was a really excellent introduction to this collection, and I hope it shows also why we felt it was so important to create a resource specifically for this collection, because it seems important to us that researchers or others who are interested in the material understand its specificity and encounter it in the context of how the collection was gathered, because it has such a fascinating and unusual history. So we're just going to hear next from Jenifer Ball, who is one of our volunteer translators, and we felt that the project there's so much gone into these translations, and such an incredible amount of care and research and passion as well for that work of taking material mostly in German, sometimes in French, more rarely in I think there's a couple of accounts in Italian and Hungarian and a couple of other languages, but mostly from German, and rendering it faithfully into English, which is challenging. And there are many accounts in here which pose specific challenges. So I'm really delighted that Jenifer Ball is joining us. So just to give you a sense of the work that's gone into it, Jenifer, during lockdown, found some, this was a good way to pass the time, and actually returned 30 texts over 9 months, which is a very impressive rate of productivity. She's currently working on a diary from Theresienstadt. And just to introduce her, she's worked doing some professional translation during her career, but was mainly a teacher of German and French. And in her professional translation work, she's covered a wide range of material. And of course, she's covered a wide range of material in many different styles in this project as well. So I'm really delighted to have you joining us this evening, Jenifer, to speak a little bit about your experience translating material from this collection. Jenifer.
Thank you very much. And I feel a little bit that I shouldn't be here. Now I've seen the faces of some of my co-translators on screen, and I understand there are about 70 of us. So I can only represent myself and hope that what I say resonates with other people, and I'm sure it will, because all translators have quite a lot in common. I first came into this by attending the curator's lecture at the Gerti Simon photograph exhibition, where the curator said, we need some more translators. And then there was a call through the newsletter from the library in autumn 2019, and I responded to that and have been translating since February 2020. So within 4 weeks of beginning, I had far more time on my hands than I'd expected. I began with French and German, and Martina said that there were no more French ones and was going to carry on sending German. We'd finished the French. As Toby said, I've now done 30 translations in 8 months, and I'm working at the moment on an extended diary from Theresienstadt, which is peppered with Czech. And my Czech is having to be somewhat challenged by just double checking that what it says is actually what the transcription includes and the handwritten annotations. So as you said, I was a teacher for 40 years, German and French, and a semi-professional translator alongside, mostly in veterinary medicine, musicology, and poetry. My experience of political terror is limited to Cold War texts, though there's a certain amount in common. The content that Martina has sent me, and that's one of the things which is quite interesting, in that you can say a little bit that you'd like a long text or a short text, but otherwise you get what you're sent. And so you're exposed to material, you have pretty well no idea what it's going to be, apart from its general context of being a survivor's document or a victim's document or a formal bureaucratic paper that might underline or support the material. So the challenge really is to enter the work that you've been sent in order to be able to render it correctly. Some of the content I've been sent is completely mundane. I had a list of index headers of people and their role, and some of it has been quite shocking. The longest report was Inge Deutschkorn, in fact, her from the beginning of the war to the end of the war, and right on through her career into the 1960s. And a short extract of that I saw when I came to see the Resistance exhibition, which was posted as a partial moment, and it was literally one paragraph from 40-something pages. But it was good to see her face. I hadn't seen a photograph of her. And that's something that's been true of almost everything I've translated, is you can hear the voice of the contributor. And I think that's the most important thing, because rendering a historical document needs to be accurate. It needs to be in the right register. But most of these have human testimony and a powerful emotional force, the need to be committed for the future, the need to record, and therefore the voice has to resonate and sound, even though you can't see it anymore. I found it quite moving to hear the voice of the people who have been giving their testimony to whoever was recording it. I've also learned a great deal, because I'm neither Jewish nor a formal historian. I've learned a great deal about elements I had not discovered. So it's been a learning journey about China, about Belgium, a lot about the forced labor program, which is less reported than the extermination element. So East Germany and the Eastern Territories were familiar, but Belgium, Holland, China, and particularly Latvia were not familiar. And I've learned an enormous amount by working on those texts. So the audible voices mean that you're working all the time on objectivity and a formal response as a professional, and the need to understand the human being, because if that voice doesn't sound through, the text loses a lot of its import and its impact. And one of the great advantages at the moment, of course, is how much work has been done since these testimonies were recorded. If I need to fact check, and you often do, because something is occasionally phonetically recorded and doesn't match and imagine that the verification exercise is going to go through that again and have another look. But if you're submitting a translation in good faith, it needs to be as accurate as you can make it. And so I found it really helpful having access to internet material to double check some of the things that I'm looking at. And it took me a while, for example, translating some poems from Theresienstadt. And I've been doing them in parallel text, because some of the poems, the poets themselves at the top say, I am not a poet. This is my attempt at poetry. And if you translate it and leave it alone on the page, it doesn't look very strong, but leave it next to the original and it continues to work. But for example, one of them referred to jargon current in Theresienstadt, which an historian may have known, but as a translator, I didn't. And I was looking for the word bonkers. And it took me quite a while, and having to read somebody's PhD, which was published in America, in order to establish that it meant something quite relevant today. Rumors circulating, which were promulgating false hope that the end might be about to happen, and which were generally not believed, but nevertheless stimulated enormous amounts of gossip. So that's a very long description of a single word, which is why the single word might still have been in the text without any explanation. And that's where the translator's note comes in. And I'm sure my fellow translators will have had to make a translator's note quite often, because I think the next reader, and as you've been saying tonight, this is open and importantly open to anyone who wants to access those texts. But the next reader may have the same issue I had, which is not knowing what it was. So the translator's note may not be necessary to a professional historian of the Holocaust, but may be essential to a student reading a passage for the first time. So there's, I think, a very quick summary is that this is a professional challenge. It's one which I have to say I enjoy as a linguist, though the content is not enjoyable necessarily. And it's an opportunity to be informed myself about the experience of victims and of survivors. And it's an opportunity to make a contribution to collective records, which will be accessible to everybody and which must be accessible to everybody. And I'm very grateful for being able to do it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. And I can't emphasize enough how grateful the library is to all of the volunteer translators who have contributed to this project. It's such an amazing gift that you've given us. So you mentioned about one of the advantages of the site being that we can continue to improve what we have, and that's in a way the wonder of having an online resource. It can continue to evolve. And of course, as well as continuing to work with translators, we'll continue to work with historians who have great interest in this material, but have also written extraordinary works already and continuing to write extraordinary works, giving us insight into the history of testimony and how we should understand testimonies, eyewitness accounts, as perhaps these materials might more properly be called. And so that's why I'm so pleased that our next speaker will be Sharon Kangisser-Cohen. As well as being the editor of Yad Vashem Studies, she's the director of the Eli and Diana Swarovski Center for the Study of the Aftermath of the Holocaust at Yad Vashem. And she's the author of several highly praised works of Holocaust scholarship, including Child Survivors of the Holocaust in Israel, Children in the Holocaust and its Aftermath, and perhaps most relevant for this evening's discussion, Testimony and Time, Holocaust Survivors Remember. We're delighted to have you join us, Sharon. Thank you.
Thank you, Toby, and thank you, Christian, and thank you to everybody who is here and who has invited me to participate. One of the things that I did do in my previous job was to actually run an archive, and I have to say your project in taking documentation, digitizing it, cataloging it, indexing it, translating it, and making it digitally accessible is no small task. And from my experience as the director of an archive, I really do think you have done an amazing job. And as a scholar, thank you for making this accessible, and also to have translated it, because we know that so much of material, of primary source material, exists in its original vernacular and doesn't always allow scholars who don't have the languages to read the material. And by translating it, you've given a wonderful gift to us as researchers. So thank you for that. The question of early survivor testimony is something that I think is only in the last, I would say, couple of years becoming more and more relevant in terms of trying to understand these early voices. And I think that one of the important scholars who brought early testimony to the fore is Dr. Alan Roseman, who brought David Boda's incredible project of David Boda, a psychologist, who traveled to Europe in 1946 and began to tape on a wire recorder the experiences and record the experiences of survivors of Nazism. And what Alan Rosen did was basically expose us to this, although some of us had worked on and researched it, but he really exposed us to this treasure of these early voices. And what the archive did eventually was make it accessible online as well. So we can hear, as you said, Jennifer, we can hear the voices of survivors in the vernacular, but also at the time, and read to the script. And Alan Rosen showed us opened us to this world of early testimony, which was overshadowed by these wonderful projects that came about in the 80s and the 90s, the Spielberg Foundation, Yad Vashem's testimonies, and audio-visual testimonies, which overtook, I think, really, or shifted our focus away from really what was sitting in archives and in boxes in institutions really around the world that hadn't been archived, that hadn't been catalogued, and hadn't been digitized. And the question, therefore, was, what is essentially the difference, or can we see a difference between testimony that's given in the immediate post-war period and testimony that's given later on? And this is, this is work that is fascinating, just in terms of how does a story or testimony develop over time. And one of the main anchors of trying to understand this is really the question of context, and which is really which is fundamental to understanding. When a person speaks about what they have experienced or what they have endured, it's fundamental for us to understand where that person is situated when they're telling that, giving that account. Where they're situated in terms of geographically, where they're situated in terms of their own, their age, or their standing, where they're situated in terms of the world understanding what has happened to them, and where they're understanding in terms of their own understanding of what has happened to them. And so early post-war testimony is so important in terms of understanding the context in which it is told, and then for understanding or trying to understand what survivors are actually trying to communicate. So context, and in terms of your collection, is paramount in understanding how these texts were constructed, not only in terms of the fact that these refugees and survivors had come to the United Kingdom and had re-established their lives there, but also in terms of the fact of how those testimonies were created. They were created according to a certain format. They were given, and then they were co-created, and then they were checked, and they were approved, which is very different from other collections, where you would have for the most part, a question and answer, which were in their own words, and sometimes, as we know, for early post-war testimonies, edited later on, but weren't necessarily approved. Or we have today a more open narrative where there is question and answers, but yet it extends what we see in the Spielberg testimonies is really there are edits and they are edited out, but essentially we also see less mediated to the fortunate archives, which are, as they claim, unmediated in terms of structure and flow. But early post-war testimony is a testimony which, for what I can understand, is essentially operates on a few levels. Number one, as many testimonies talk to this point, is that how can I encapsulate all these years in one telling? Right? I am making, through my telling, a selection of what I am going to talk about. When I'm giving a page of testimony of how I survived, that cannot in any way reflect the years of persecution or the months or the days, right? So what we're having is a distilled memory of what I understand early testimony to be is, how did I survive? Why me? What can explain this phenomenal experience of me being here when the majority of our families, communities have been murdered, right? And the question not only comes from a why me or why have I survived, it also comes from a context that's looking at survivors and saying, how did you survive? What did you do? Whether it's something that's empathic or whether there is something that in some cases became accusatory. So for what I can see developing is a distilling of all these years and all of these months of experience into fundamentally answering a question of what happened, how did I survive? And the link in those stories are really bringing the person to explain, for the most part, what I've seen chronologically, which is also very interesting. We know people also speak associatively, but chronologically of how X led to Y, led to Z, to the fact that I'm standing here. Not necessarily giving you a reason for it, whether it's luck, whether it's fate, whether it's help, or whatever reason they give for their survival, but essentially a point a direction for us to understand how they avoided what Imre Kertész talks about is the fate of European Jewry, which was for the most part murder. How did I escape that? How am I here? The second part of it is obviously trying to, what Henry Greenspan talks about is how do I make a story? How do I tell something of something which is essentially not a story, which is something which is about persecution, which is about trauma, which is about loss, which is about suffering. How do I link that together to be able to give something a coherent narrative? How do I take trauma and pain and loss, and how do I organize it in order to communicate it? And making a story of what is not a story is essentially the beginnings of what survivors begin to create of a narrative script of their survival, which over time gets repeated, because that became the suitcase, or that's the container, or that's the frame through which they are able now to utter and then to communicate a essentially chaotic, unimaginable experience. So the process of the early tellings is a way in which we can create a script, in a way which we can communicate, and in a way which we can ultimately give meaning for ourselves in terms of our stories, in terms of survivors. And the other part of the early survivor testimony is the question of taking a radical experience and being able to communicate it to an audience or to interviewers or to post-war communities who have absolutely no idea of what it meant to be a Jew in Nazi-occupied Europe. And we can see this very, very clearly in Alan Boda's work, where Alan Boda, who came from Europe, but who had spent the war in the United States, comes to Europe in 1946 and is unable to even understand what survivors are saying. How can it be that you weren't allowed to go to the toilet whenever you wanted to? That's one of the things that Alan Boda can't understand. What do you mean? And that there were no place for you to sleep, right? He's grappling with a foreign, totally different reality. And he is not accusing or interrogating the memory. He's simply just unable to believe what they're saying. And then through the process of conversation, David Boda makes a transition to being able to understand more. And that's the process that these survivors and refugees are engaging with. They're engaging with an audience, for the most part, who have not experienced what they've experienced. And yet they are trying to communicate a different world and a different reality. And then having to be able to respond, or having to respond to the incredulity of their audience. So for some survivors, they would say, I will keep trying to communicate until they get it, or they don't understand. I have no empathic audience. There is no other. And therefore, I might just stop speaking or stop telling. And so what is interesting here is that we have very different levels of making a story of what is not a story, condensing the story into something that's tellable, and also the enormous effort that it takes to be able to communicate an experience that they know that the other side, or whoever that is, doesn't always have the ability, or they say, the imagination to be able to understand what they have experienced and what they have been through. Mm. So that's early testimony in terms of its brilliance. And what becomes is that it's a raw initial beginning of grappling with not just giving a story about, but also internalizing of what a person has, as an individual, has experienced, and then integrating that later on into their larger life stories.
Thank you. That process is so fascinating, endlessly fascinating, and actually that sort of process of meaning making through these testimonies, it strikes me that still continues today in certain respects. We just did a Holocaust Memorial Day event with Keir Starmer and Lord Pickles last Friday, and we used some of the testimonies in translation. And they had such extraordinary power, and they reminded me of some of the things you've said about the ways in which the act of creating these testimonies was kind of a form of meaning making, but they still have an incredible power to help us to try and access meaning out of these events, which, as you say, are shocking and very hard, very radical, and often very hard to understand for outsiders who didn't experience it. So I'm sorry to move the agenda onwards, but I'm conscious of time, and I want to introduce our last speaker. Thank you, Sharon. I want to introduce our last speaker, Mark Roseman. Mark is the historian of modern Europe, and he has a focus on German, European, and Jewish history. And also the comparative history of genocide. And he's written several very well-known books, including The Past in Hiding, which won the library's Frankel Prize, and also The Villa, The Lake, The Meeting, Wannsee and the Final Solution, and more recently, Lives Reclaimed, a story of rescue and resistance in Nazi Germany. And actually, maybe just before I hand over to you, Mark, I'll mention that rescue and resistance are themes which come out very strongly in this particular collection. We used several testimonies in our recent exhibition on Jewish resistance to the Holocaust. And we have also got a section on the site which allows you to browse by theme, and rescue and resistance are two of the key themes within the collection. So it's absolutely my pleasure to have you join us this evening to speak a little bit about your thoughts on this resource.
Thanks very much, Toby. Anybody who comes at the end of such a splendid long panel is reminded of the German humorist Tucholsky's dictum, alles ist schon gesagt worden, aber noch nicht von jedem. Everything's already been said, but not yet by everyone. So here's my turn. And it's a pleasure to see so many friends and colleagues in the audience, and also to be able to publicly acknowledge my debt to the wonderful institution, the Wiener Library. Christine asked me to talk about the value of the materials for research. In some ways, it's a bit of a slam dunk that making such original voices about the Holocaust so accessible for research and teaching is an obvious good, that the point hardly needs worth underlining, and certainly not to this audience. I mean, there are so many remarkable accounts. I've only just started getting sort of wetting my feet in it, but so many incredible accounts. The proud First World War I veteran who worked as secretary at his synagogue in Offenbach got on with all the Nazis, he says, until the brutal experience of the November pogrom and then concentration camp swept away his world. The well-to-do entrepreneur woman in Breslau who was rather insouciant about conditions until a stray remark about Goebbels landed her in prison and suddenly made her see the need to leave the country. The Viennese teacher whose family connections led her to Shanghai. The Dresdner man in mixed marriage who ended up in Auschwitz and sends a letter listing the brutal fates of one member of the community after another, and on and on and on. I do want to, as others have done, commend the presentation of this resource. It's quite fantastic. It's beautifully flexible with the original scan, the translation, searchable, fully downloadable. It's just a wonderful, flexible tool for research and for teaching, and I've no doubt that I will be using it in future for both. It's also a particular kind of resource, and this is what I want to get at in my remaining remarks, although as I say, some of this is a little bit speculative because I'm only myself beginning to feel my way through the collection. Well, in what way particular? Well, they're not like the sort of testimony that has been collected from the late 70s into the 2000s, when a great deal of attention was being given to Holocaust survivors, and a lot of resources were devoted to collecting videotaped testimony. The Fortune Art Archive at Yale was the first of these. The Shoah Foundation, started by Steven Spielberg, the most famous and extensive. And these sources are not like that, not only because they're written and not taped or videoed. Because from the 1970s, interviewees were asked to provide a life story of their experience, as Sharon said. And a lot of questions sought to get at the emotional experience, the qualities it took to survive. That's not totally different from what's here, but nonetheless does not really match what was being asked and not what was being provided to Eva Reichman and her colleagues in many cases. The subtle difference is between the victim and survivor as the subject of interest and the survivor as the witness of interest. And it's the latter that characterizes this collection much more than the video testimonies that we know from the Spielberg Foundation. From the 1970s, victim and survivor as subject, from sticking with that for a moment rather than as witness, attracted the attention of psychologists, literary scholars, and other disciplines. For a long time, less so historians. We learned a great deal about the emotional burden of surviving and living with the memory of survival. As Sharon was talking about, the impossibility of communicating, the impact of trauma, and so on. Themes that the Wiener materials may be less helpful for, though they may help understand the Wiener testimonies, and themes which the robust matter-of-factness of many of the Wiener accounts perhaps at least call some of the more fanciful claims of incommunicability into question. Historians of the Holocaust, as against these other disciplines, were rather slower to use victim and survivor voices. But in the 90s, as more historians came to, well, I say that, of course, there were early historians, as Sharon says, back in the very early post-war period, who did wonderful work collecting. That a lot of that got we lost that from view. And it's really only since the 1990s that, as she said, that we've begun to recover the early historical work that was being done in the DP camps in Germany or by Jewish historians who survived in Poland or in France. Since the 1990s, historians of the Holocaust have also begun to turn more to victim voices, and recognizing not just the importance of understanding victims' own lives and trajectories, but also recognizing that we can't understand policy and perpetrators without hearing the victims as well. And in the first wave of Western historians looking for victim voices, many sought to use original voices from the time, untainted by later knowledge. If you look at Saul Friedlander's big 2-volume history, he's very often using diary accounts, scraps of paper written during the war, and making much less use of post-war resources. The US Holocaust Memorial Museum series, Jewish Responses to Persecution, uses only documents from the time, and there's virtually nothing in there used after the war. And there were certainly sound reasons, an attempt to reclaim the original experience when no one knew where things were headed and where the full scale of what was happening was not yet clear. But it did mean relinquishing or not taking advantage of the sources that were collected in the early post-war period. In the last few years, however, and again, Sharon alluded to this, so I am having a Tucholsky moment, historians have been rediscovering the importance of the early post-war research on survivors. And there's not just David Boda's work with his wire tape recorder, but as I say, there's the Jewish historian survivors in Poland who did an amazing amount of collecting of testimony and of writing early accounts. And the Wiener Library has articles from Philip Friedman from 1950, for example, asking what's left to do on the Holocaust because so much work had already been done. And historians now are interested in this both in terms of writing the history of a forgotten scholarship, but also recovering how much raw data was collected. Children who had survived hiding in Poland, survivors in the camps, and so on. And this is where the Wiener Library comes in, offering yet another vantage point with some of the same strengths as that immediate post-war material, but I think with some unique accents and strengths. And I just want to mention a couple of these before I finish. First, as already been mentioned, of course, it's strongly influenced by German and Austrian perspective. There are other voices, and of course, some of those who are providing information are survivors of deportations in camps, and so experience the extremities there alongside Jews from other nations. But they form a predominant part of this collection. And I think the importance of that is not just we're learning about these countries as against other European countries, but also that they are in a position to talk about the formation of Nazi policy, the evolution, the patterns of participation that helped to shape the trajectory from the earliest steps of persecution through to the years of extermination. And that vantage point, I think, is key. And that point is reinforced, I think, and again, this is a little bit speculative because I need to see more of the collection if this really is the case across the board. But it seems to me that one of the distinctive things about this collection as against the voices that were able to be collected by David Boder on the DP camps is the age range is larger. And that's because, of course, those Jews who had experienced maturity in the 1930s, but had not managed to get out of Europe before the killing years, have a very, very, very limited chance of surviving, even related to the generally poor chances of survival, unless they happen to be in mixed marriage in Germany or in Theresienstadt or in one or two other exceptional circumstances. But if they had managed to emigrate by 1938 or 1939, then there's a chance of a group of more mature individuals who had already got to know a pre-Nazi Germany, had experienced the transformation process in the 1930s, being able here to give voice to their experiences. And that is a really important distinctive element, I think, of this collection. Finally, and again, this has been alluded to, I think what's so fascinating, and of course it makes it somewhat harder to know exactly how to take some of the judgments. In the 1950s, this is a point at which those who have survived or those who emigrated before the war are finding their feet in the post-war period. They're re-establishing connections or not with their former homeland. There are economic and financial ties being established as the claims conference takes shape. So there's this, we're observing or listening in these testimonies also to the process by which those who are being interviewed are reflecting on their own background and their relationship to Germany, their post-war lives and so on. And that too is a very distinctive and I think important moment, not always easy for the student or the researcher to know how to interpret every statement, but nevertheless a vantage point, a moment of observation that really, really stands out. And so for all those reasons, I think this is just a wonderful resource, quite apart from the technical and translation feats that make it so accessible. So I'm really thrilled to be able to sing its praises. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Mark. It's so rewarding to hear your reflections and to think about the many ways in which this is going to spark new discoveries and interesting thoughts on the many people who are going to use it as a resource. And I'm sure I can speak for others who have been involved in the project that it really makes the work worthwhile. So thank you. And thank you also to all of our contributors. So we do have a couple of minutes for questions, and there are a couple that are already in the chat. I would urge you to please post a question in the chat if you'd like to ask any questions to our panelists. We had one that was about whether there's overlap with other existing testimony collections. So asking about specifically the Spielberg collection. There is some. We looked into this a little bit when we were doing one of the less glamorous aspects of the project, which was about data protection and copyright, which is looking at the material that was already out there. And we discovered that there were a good few dozen that existed in other testimonies collections, not these accounts, but of course subsequent accounts, not just in the Spielberg collection, but in the, for example, the Holocaust Museum in Washington's oral history collection. I think it'd be interesting to do a piece of work to actually determine all of those overlaps and maybe make some of those links available on the website where possible. But that's a piece of work that still remains to be done. We had another question about other languages to translate from. We mentioned about the French translations already being finished. I'll have to pay a big tribute to Sue Boswell, who did an amazing job with the French material. There is most of the material that's still to be translated is German. I think there aren't really any more minor languages left in the collection to translate. I think that there was 1 or 2 Hungarian and Italian accounts, as I mentioned, but I think we may already have found solutions for translating those. But we want to do other translation projects in the future once this project is finished. So there's definitely huge numbers of fascinating items in other languages in the library's collections. Yiddish, Hebrew, Polish. So if you do have specialist language skills and might be interested in becoming a translator, please do get in touch. We might not be able to give you work straight away, but one of the things we often say is it would be great to have you on our books because, you know, things do come up for exhibitions and so on, and an archive and library can never have too many language specialists in its wider network. So please do get in touch with us if you'd like to be on our books as a possible volunteer translator. Okay, I'm not seeing any more questions coming up in the chat. So before I just say a concluding thanks, do any of the other panelists want to, perhaps I should quickly just allow the other panelists just to say a last word on having heard from the others. So Christine, did you want to say anything having heard from Sharon and Mark?
Oh, I think, no, I mean, I would just say that it was a pleasure to hear both of their perspectives on this, considering the wider context and the wider history, and, you know, particularly thinking about the relationship of this collection to what came before, because it sort of came in this kind of middle period, as you sort of established, Sharon. And then, as Mark said, you're thinking about, you're trying to unpack that context of what people were saying at this time and why. And that generation too, which I think is also an interesting question that Mark raised, in looking at a particular age group in this collection, which may not be as easily found in later testimony projects. So all things that I'm thinking about, definitely, and I'm sure others will be as well. So thanks for these comments.
Thank you, Christine. And Sharon, I felt like I slightly cut you off. So did you have anything?
No, it's all good. We can all go talking about these issues for forever, because this is what we do. So it's good you cut me off, but I wanted to say to Mark that is so correct in pointing out that the value of hearing testimony of the 30s in Germany and Austria is so important, because what comes after is so dramatic that the terror and the fear and of what was happening for German and Austrian Jews in the 30s gets sublimated because of what happens after. And it's so important to bring to focus those experiences as well. So that's something that's very, very valuable for us.
Thank you. And Jenifer, rather than coming back to you individually, I did appreciate what you said about, I think you did a fantastic job of speaking about the experience of translating. You know, it's been such a pleasure to see so many translators who contributed to this project in the gallery of faces here this evening. And I think it is appropriate to end maybe even just with a round of applause for the amazing work of all of the volunteers, especially the translators. So thank you very much for everything that you've done. It's honestly, it's a huge achievement, and we couldn't be more grateful. So I think that does bring us to a close this evening. It's been a really wonderful, fascinating experience for me, and as I said, at all of our online events, although our physical doors are closed, our virtual doors are open. So please do keep in touch with the library. If you, I'm sure you're going to be spending time looking at this particular website, but also if you have more time online, which I think probably you will, then do visit the library's new main website as well, because that's just relaunched. And on the homepage, you can also see the video of our Holocaust Memorial Day event, which I mentioned, and which features some of the testimonies from this project. So with that, I'll just conclude by saying thank you to our speakers, and thank you to all of you for joining me this evening. Bye-bye.